Well, I'll do the how did I end up in Houston part first, which was totally unexpected. Had never really heard of Houston. Had grown up in Europe, then I'd gone to school in the East Coast, then I'd gotten married and went out to the West Coast. So the whole center of the country was a complete mystery to me. And but Houston was a great place for my husband's job. So in those days, you kind of moved where the main breadwinner moved. And off we went. I did not yet have a job. I had just studied economics at UCLA as a graduate student. So we ended up in Houston. The refinery smell permeated my first night in Houston. And then when I woke up the next morning, the convicts were cutting down the crepe myrtle trees on the clover leaf at Waugh and Memorial. So that was my introduction to Houston, which I have grown to love. I mean, I think it's now a great international city and very friendly, and I absolutely love Houston. But at the beginning was not quite that way. Okay, so why did I go to law school? Well, here I was in Houston and I needed to get a job. I didn't know if I would get a job because I knew nobody in Houston, basically. So I applied to oil companies as an economist. They were the biggest employers, it seemed, who used economists in town. But in case I didn't get a job offer, I offered to teach at St. Thomas University, which was right next to the apartments I lived on Montrose. And I've always loved to teach. I taught economics at UCLA. And then I thought, well, what if no one wants me? What do I do? I'll just go to law school. And but I really didn't want to be a lawyer. I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be an international business person like my father had been, because he had a very interesting career. He'd come home from all over the world with great stories to tell, from Russia, from Saudi Arabia. So that's what I really wanted to do. And I thought, well, eventually I'll get there somehow or other. But I just went to law school at night just to become a better business person, not to become a lawyer at all. Or a law professor. Never even thought of doing that. Well, I was a night student, so my perspective is one of, this is not my main job. This is not my main career. This is not something I'm going to want to do as a career. Again, I was on the track to be an international businesswoman through Exxon. So I would say, having gotten a lot of other educations from other kinds of schools, that it was, to me, a rather, this is going to sound a rather sleepy law school. It did a lot of practical work. The teachers were practitioners. They knew how to teach, the recording statute and all of that. But for really getting kind of big picture views of constitutional law or sort of how the law shaped society, that was absent in my days, as was a choice of classes. There was not even an environmental law class taught when I went through. So I had no real choice of classes. But nonetheless, I did quite well. And I just came at 6 o'clock in the evening, hoped there was an ice cream sandwich in the machine because there was no food around. And then I'd go back home at 9 and go to work the next day and do it all over again for 4 or 5 days straight. So it was hardly your traditional approach to law school. But I enjoyed, my favorite class, without a doubt, was Irene Rosenberg's criminal law class. I no more wanted to teach criminal law or go near or practice criminal law than, fly to the moon. But she was so dynamic, and she did the kind of big picture view at the same time that she gave you the nuts and bolts of sort of what criminal law is all about. And it was just fascinating. And my second favorite professor was her husband, Yale Rosenberg. And I think that speaks very much to the quest that the University of Houston Law Center took in the early mid 70s to hire from outside, to try and get people in from other schools to be more of a national law school. And I think in that regard, it has succeeded thoroughly well, tremendously well. The classes that we teach now are at the cutting edge of any kind of legal topic that you can name, whether it be environment, energy, climate change, patent law, tax law, it is just a superb law school now, but that was hardly the law school I went to. I had a baby, and at that time, Exxon had absolutely zero ability to help a woman professional. They had not really had one going through their ranks who had children. So I was going to have to move, because usually when you work for an oil company, you start moving around into upper management. And it was sort of like, well, fine, but if you move me to, White Plains, New York, or someplace or other, how do you help my husband get a job? Well, we don't do that. And it was sort of like, well, how do I manage all of this then and really start traveling? And when you have a firstborn, it's kind of an amazingly huge experience. So it was sort of like, well, and then unfortunately, another one of my favorite professors, Simon Frank, who had taught me oil and gas law, had unfortunately died about 2 weeks before the fall semester in 1976. And the law school, knowing that I worked at Exxon, assuming I knew huge amounts of Texas oil and gas law, which I didn't, I knew more antitrust law than I knew anything else, called me and said, could you teach this class? And this firstborn baby was born on October 1st. And I said, no, I'm 9.5 months pregnant already, and I can't teach the class. But I remembered the phone call. And so when I realized that this wasn't going to work at Exxon, that it was just too hard to do a dual career couple when you were going to be, you had no support from from an institutional viewpoint, that I called them back and I said, you still need someone to teach oil and gas. I'd be glad to teach it. And that's how I got started. Again, I just fell into it, just complete serendipity. And I fell into the career that couldn't have been better personally and professionally than any career I'd never thought about before. Well, I think what I enjoyed most is developing problem sets where the students could work on them themselves and see if they actually had understood the law, the reading assignment, and then do a little problem set, and then we discuss it the next day in class. But in that way, you could it's the way I kind of best learned. Give me a practical problem, give me a client who's going to walk into the office with an oil and gas question, and let's discuss how we can work on that question. So side by side with the oil and gas casebook that I used at the time, I developed my own set of problem sets. And that is just me. I am quite practical. So the thing I worried most about going into teaching was research. I just figured, well, I'm not going to like research. I'm far too pragmatic and practical, and I really want to be a business person. And I mean, I'd written theses in undergraduate and graduate school, but it was still, not something that my heart felt, geez, you really love to do research. But I ended up actually loving it. I would just ask what I thought were important questions that no one else had asked, and then I'd just dig in and try and find the answers. So I could not understand during the OPEC embargo, for instance, why Texas did not have a compulsory unitization statute that would make us much more efficient in our oil fields, and we could produce a lot more oil during this terrible, terrible shortage. So I investigated why we didn't, which was a lot of legal history going back into the 30s and the Great Depression and the great power of Humble Oil and Refining, now Exxon. And I ended up with a 500-page book that no one had asked me to write. And this was like, how am I going to get tenured if no one publishes this book? And I hadn't realized I had actually created a whole book because I just did it chapter by chapter and saved it on little discs. Probably don't remember how people used to save things on little discs that were about 7 inches by 7 inches. So anyhow, when it finally got printed out, I had this book, and then a Washington, D.C. think tank, Resource Future, said, we'll publish it. And that sort of set me on the road of being an actual scholar, which I had never in my wildest dreams thought I would be. So, and then I ended up enjoying that, especially when I had great research assistants and wonderful research librarians. Another thing that U of H Law Center did to help raise the rankings of the school and to support the faculty was to get some really good librarians in and reference librarians who could help you, people like Chris Dykes and whatever. So we did a lot of good things at the Law Center while I was there for the reputation and the earned reputation of the Law Center. It has so much more potential to do even more. And especially being in Houston. And you may think from reading some newspapers that the oil and gas industry is going to die out. And it will eventually. There will be peak oil, probably in 10 years. And certainly there will be peak gasoline demand with all the electric vehicles coming in fairly shortly. But I'm still connected to Houston, even though I live in Washington, D.C. now. So I've spent many, many hours listening to the Greater Houston Partnership and U of H's energy departments talk about the Center for Houston's Future, I think it's called. On the future of Houston, what will Houston be in 50 years, and how would lawyers serve that? Is the question you asked me. And the Greater Houston Partnership and a lot of the oil companies and the great scientists and lawyers in Houston would like to still see it be the energy capital of the world, but it'll be a leader in hydrogen production. It'll be a leader in carbon sequestration, carbon capture, where you capture it from big power plants and all those chemical industries down the petrochemical complexes. And then you store it. So that involves a lot of pipelines and a lot of wells being built to store the CO2. The world will not make it if we don't start storing a lot of carbon. We are far beyond the point where we can simply mitigate by cutting back carbon dioxide emissions and still get to under 2 degrees centigrade. And then now we have great environmental professors who we were probably one of the first law schools to ever even teach a course in climate change litigation. That's being taught now by Tracy Hester, and we have a whole host of other people, Victor Flatt and other folks who are in that mix right between energy and the environment. And all of those skills and patent law skills and bankruptcy skills. I'm sure some of the startups are going to go bankrupt. Maybe some of the big guys are going to go bankrupt too if they don't adapt pretty quickly. All of those skills at the law school will still be required, and they'll just be going into these new industries and developing industries, hydrogen, carbon capture, bioenergy, advanced bioenergy sources. If any of the listeners would like to go tune into the Center for Houston's Future, I think it's called, and look at some of those webinars, you can see this incredible dynamic view of what Houston could be if it decides to do it. And Houston is that kind of a town. If you decide to do something, it tends to get done. It'll require a lot of state and federal policy to support it, though, and that's where I fear the whole kind of dysfunctional politics of the day is not going to help us in that regard. But the law school, I think, is very well positioned to provide that kind of leadership support to the new industries as well as the current ones that it serves right now. It's actually kind of exciting. Well, two things kind of have equal sway. Number one is still keeping a hand in scholarship and some consulting and keeping updates going to this international petroleum book that I've written, which now needs constant updating because there's net zero going on all over the world and the European Green Deal, and maybe something will happen in the United States in that regard too. So I write a lot of updates that I post to websites. But the other half is really just family, and that's why I moved east to be near family. And so we have grandchildren that are within driving. Two are within walking distance, and they are so much fun because the thing I missed most about not teaching is not being around young people. And with the pandemic, I didn't go and volunteer to start teaching. I did a Zoom class internationally and just don't like Zoom. So, I guess those two take up my time. And then my husband and I love to travel, so at some point we hope we can still do that. And then we love to have people visit us. So a former student came by yesterday, and we spent a couple of hours with her. She got stranded in between airports because of weather in DC, and she has a fantastic job in business development with Schlumberger in their new energy section. So she's doing bioenergy in California from agricultural wastes with carbon capture and sequestration. And those are the kinds of really exciting opportunities that the law school can train people for, and I think our students would be able to move into pretty easily. So we'd love to have more visitors. Any of you coming through DC, and especially if you're a former student or one of my colleagues, do let us know. We'd love to show off DC.